This is the second presentation on the sword and the shield policy. This one contains the analogy, understanding priorities as a result of the sword and the shield, and its implications. Don't forget the overview is contained in a separate presentation. With what I hope you'll find is an interesting quote. The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. That was from the much maligned Winston Churchill. Now, historically, the problem with pre-war planning for the defender is that the aggressor can determine the time and place of major attacks, as well as how they are conducted. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is an excellent example. In general, the aggressor usually has a pretty good idea of the defender's plans and can work out tactics to overcome their strengths. Strategic planners draw lines on a map. Those lines are supposed to reflect strategy, but too often they develop their own internal logic. I'm going to use France in 1940 as an example. In what I call the law of unintended consequences, drawing these lines on a map creates a rigidity in thought that can create failure, if not disaster. This is the Allied operational plan in 1940 to stop a German invasion. They expected a replay of the German attack in the First World War. The original defence line was contained in Belgium, but as the French realised it could be flanked to the north, it steadily expanded up into the Netherlands. The fortified city of Liège, with its ultra-modern extension to the north at Ibn-Amal, was a shield which would protect the Allied advance. 3 French armies and the BEF would move west to protect the Belgian capital and stop the Germans before they entered France. Meanwhile, the Germans came up with tactical innovations to overcome the fortress defences, and of course they then launched their main attack against the French centre. Dunkirk was the result. All lines have a starting point. The one I am looking at started in 1922 at a place called Singapore. The Royal Navy looked at the growing strength of Japan and, like many naval strategists of the time, looked to their numerical advantage in capital ships to crush the Japanese in the event of war. Obtaining that numerical superiority required reinforcement by a large proportion of the home fleet. The problem for the British is that, with this deployment to the Far East, you can't call it the home fleet if it's on the other side of the world. Therefore, despite the lessons of the First World War that naval campaigns between major powers are attritional, the Royal Navy planned for a blockade of Japan, but hoped for a Tsushima, that astonishing naval battle in 1904 in which the Japanese Navy destroyed the Russian fleet. Still, whether it was a long or short campaign, the Royal Navy had to meet the needs of its fleet while operating in the Far East. The Royal Navy ships, both large and small, that were operating in the Pacific were far from its bases where they could repair and refit. Without going into detail, the Royal Navy needed additional infrastructure in the Pacific closer to any operational theatre. The magnificent harbour at Singapore was the obvious choice. In 1923, a 15-year project to build a naval base in Singapore was commenced, so a star was born. Sorry about that. A year later, Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer. In Australia, he would be called the Treasurer. Churchill supported the naval strategy for Singapore, but was also responsible for the cost of building the naval base and its protecting fortress with its big guns. Although now increasingly maligned, at that time he noted that Japan could make elaborate plans for a landing on the mainland and an attack on Singapore from that direction. They might possibly be able to construct tanks or other mechanical contrivances which would be capable of drawing guns through the forest. But the Chief of the Imperial General Staff insisted that a large-scale landward attack was impossible, and Churchill did not press the matter. Forgotten is that those big guns, plus small ships and submarines, did in fact protect Singapore from naval attack. The Americans later in the Pacific War showed that an amphibious attack, with enough mass and courage, could succeed against the toughest defences, but a direct attack on Singapore was probably beyond the Japanese Navy's capabilities once those defences were in place, which meant that, as Churchill noted, the only realistic threat to Singapore was an assault from Malaysia. This meant that the British Army needed to provide some defence just of Singapore. In 1936, the British recognised that Japan's growing military strength made it possible for them to conduct a landing in Malaysia. The star on the map became a line. Of course, Hitler was to come to power 5 years before the Singapore naval base was finally completed in 1938. As the threat from the continent grew, it became increasingly unlikely that not enough of the home fleet could be spared to take on the Japanese. The very foundation of the Singapore strategy, the very reason for the money spent on Singapore's naval infrastructure and defences, collapsed in 1935 with the beginnings of the expansion of the German Navy, and war in Europe was still 4 years away. All too often, the fall of Singapore is just looked at from a British perspective. Similarly, in the West, we tend to look at Singapore, the Philippines, etc. as separate events. To the Japanese, they were all just part of an initial plan of an attack. In fact, if you step back before the Pacific War, there is actually another line extending from French Indochina down past the US colony of the Philippines and then down to the northern coast of New Guinea. To the Japanese, the fortresses of this line were Singapore, Corregidor, and the island outpost of Wake Island that lay between Japan and its Pacific territories. Back then, depending on your view, one side was trying to contain fascist Japan, the other was a righteous Japan striking out at the colonial empires, trying to keep it from its true place in the world. It's both an interesting comparison and a warning. So let me flip sides to the Japanese for a little bit. From 1930, Japanese strategic policy was focused on China. It launched several limited wars from its Korean colony. Eventually, it established a puppet state in Manchuria, requiring a massive and brutal campaign against Chinese partisans. Japan's aims, specifically, was to turn parts, if not all, of China into a colony which would enrich Japan in a similar way to how India had enriched Britain. I know it is more subtle than this, and that I'm ignoring other influences such as the role of racial superiority, military ideology, land grants for the Japanese, and even personal aggrandizement. Yet, for the regime, the real benefit of colonization was as a propaganda tool. Again, simplistically, Japanese civilians worked extreme hours, became impoverished, saw their conscripted children die, all in the name of patriotism and the belief of the promised rewards victory would bring. That again may sound familiar to those looking at contemporary China and Taiwan, especially now that the long-term impact of the economic downturn in China is unknown. In order to support the wars in China, the Japanese naval focus was protecting the Sea of Japan, slowly extending south. Through these seas flowed the men and material the Japanese army needed to achieve its conquest in China. In reality, nothing else mattered. Again, the South China Sea provides the current focus for China, with their primary objective being Taiwan. To the Japanese Navy, however, the real threat was America. So what were their Japanese priorities for a major Pacific war depending on the year? This is what it looked like on the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I'm going to use a very simple scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being a major assault to occupy territory, 2 being containment or raids, sometimes quite significant. 3 is, for want of a better comparison, a wish list should the opportunity arise. And 4 is everything else, just because military planners feel the need to categorize everything. Note that I haven't got into scaling the actual resources for an attack. In this instance, 1 may represent the enormous resources needed for the Allied invasion at Normandy, or it may represent the surprisingly small resources needed for the conquest of Hong Kong. Equally, the containment or raid represented by a priority 2 could range from Pearl Harbor to the midget submarines attack on Sydney. Yet, Just 10 years earlier, the priorities in the Pacific War represented much smaller aims. This is a subjective assessment, but in 1932, the year before Hitler took power, and before the massive increase in modern Japanese warships and air power, priorities in an offensive war would have looked like this. Note the almost complete lack of naval objectives, as the main aim of the Imperial Japanese Navy was protecting the Sea of Japan and neutralizing Wake Island. Priorities are modified largely by changes in relative strength. In 1940, prior to the fall of France and combined with a massive increase in Japanese naval strength, priorities may well have looked like this. Note that Singapore is a 2. It's not that Japan didn't recognise its strategic importance, it's that they didn't have the strength or means to attack it. After the fall of France and with the occupation of northern Indochina in late 1940, the priority for Singapore changed from 2 to 1 and became achievable when Japan occupied southern Indochina and brought Singapore in range of land-based aircraft. Let's go back to the British. In order to defend Singapore from attack from the mainland, the line on the map kept creeping north, even needed to invade a neutral country. As the line crept north, it needed more resources to man it. The line's inexorable logic meant that a fortified base that was to be the site from which the Royal Navy would defeat Japan instead became a drain that sucked in men and resources from Britain and India. Those resources were needed to defend a base that no longer had any real role except to benefit Japan if it was captured. When the Japanese did attack, the results were predictable. They could choose the time, place and manner of their attack. Churchill, who had cautioned against Fortress Singapore, was bound by the same logic to at least to attempt to fulfill the purpose of all that money and men. The loss of the Prince of Wales and the repulse was the result. Singapore was the greatest defeat in the history of the British Empire, and it all started with a line on the map. Australia's entire pre-war Pacific strategy was based on Singapore, and the inexorable logic of that line on the map meant that, as the risk of war increased, Australia would dispatch both men and planes to help in its defence. This is despite the fact that the Royal Navy would never arrive in force. We would lose nearly 1/4 of the volunteers in the infantry of the 2nd AIF, as well as about 1/4 of the RAAF. Although the aircraft destroyed was second-rate, the pilots and the specialist ground crew lost became a serious blow to the defence of Australia. The pre-Second World War choice by many successive Australian governments to reduce defence expenditure by focusing on the offensive power of the Royal Navy is an interesting comparison to the impact of the DSR. America is now providing the truly long-range strike capability whose acquisition in whatever form we abandoned once we joined up with the sword and the shield. The previous section was interesting and hopefully will stir up quite some debate. Note that I couldn't cover as much as I would like and probably covered too much. Yet the only real question of all that is how it relates to the sword and the shield policy. To do so, I'm going to do an assessment from China's point of view, starting from the 50s. There was a certain irrationality in China's strategic policy, especially under Mao, for at least the first 30 years of communist rule, that is, until Deng's takeover. Luckily, for the rest of the world, Mao's domestic policies resulted in an unbelievable number killed by mass murder and famine, which, combined with economic suicide, meant that China's ability to project any military force was very limited in size and distance. When Deng did take over, his policy of economic liberalization in the 80s started the growth of China's economy, which then dragged the military into becoming a modern force with steadily improving weaponry. Still, by 1990, the Chinese priorities in the Pacific would have looked something like this. Like the Japanese in the 30s, there's not a lot of naval objectives. However, unlike Japan's outright military conquest, China started to advance its claims through the so-called grey zone tactics. China's actual military capabilities remain quite low. 2 years later, a hardliner by the name of Xi took over. Everything was to change. By 2010, China's priorities would have grown in number and now include Okinawa, plus Guam, and also the US Air Force bases in Japan on their wish list. A tremendous amount of the growth in China's military power was relative. Under Obama, the US Navy was to reach its nadir, having dropped from almost 300 major combatant ships under Reagan to well below 180 under Obama. This is depressingly similar to my historical example of the Royal Navy's capacity in Singapore as Hitler rose to power. By 2020, it would have looked something like this. US and Japanese self-defense air bases in Japan are the biggest changes. At this point, the risk of escalation that China has to manage is twofold. Firstly, somehow avoiding an escalating war with Japan beyond the American air bases, which frankly is unlikely. Secondly, avoiding escalation with the US that may go nuclear. These initial priorities will remain unchanged until 2030. I've left the Pacific to the north of Australia out so far, but let's look at a likely priority list by China, both with and without the sword and the shield policy. Right up until 2010, it probably remained fairly static. It's doubtful whether Australia was even on any of their planning maps. In 2020, prior to the DSR and the AUKUS program and the formalisation of the sword and the shield policy, the Chinese priorities for Australia and its north may have included Tyndall on their wish list. That's it. 10 years later, without these program and policies, any Chinese priorities for Australia would largely have remained unchanged. I'll discuss this a little bit more further on. However, I do have one caveat on this assessment, which is that the continued independence of Taiwan is crucial to Australia's defence. Its loss will change everything. Instead, with the sword and the shield policy, by 2030 Australia will have become integral to defence of the first island chain. US aircraft will deploy to provide a fairly powerful strike force against any Chinese attack on Taiwan. Therefore, in response by China, the number of potential targets grows dramatically. They now include some form of raid against RAF Tyndall and Darwin to try and degrade American options for Taiwan's defence. The Western Bear bases have joined the wish list, as has Pine Gap. It's an interesting comparison to the situation facing Singapore in 1941. Australia is relying on the protection of the mighty US Navy. Unfortunately, like Singapore, its focus is far away, operating with and protected by Guam, Okinawa and the Japanese airfields. Equally, in committing to being the shield for the US sword, the defence of the first island chain is sucking Australian men and material north, with the RAF called upon to defend the American bombers. The rather bizarre new role for the major Army Reserve units in the southeast sees them moving north to protect the string of Western bases. Arguably, the changes to the Army and proposed new air defences are to see them become nothing more than an adjunct to the US military in the defence of their long-range strike capabilities engaged with fighting in the first island chain. By 2040, the situation for Australia is starting to get quite serious. Any rational assessment of Chinese priorities towards Australia has them growing dramatically. As better and more powerful submarines become available to the Chinese, then the priority listing for Australia in 2040 starts to look like this. Remember that a priority 2 means that it is not the target of a major attack, but that it is the subject of raids. One of the more interesting aspects of this threat assessment is that the risk moves south, especially the major RAF airfields at Amberley and Williamstown, plus the naval facilities and shipyards in the west. This completely defeats the concept behind the DSR. In my book, I discuss how Chinese technological development is overcoming the defensive value of Australia's relative geographic isolation. I'll try to show you what I mean on this map. This is the coverage of the very impressive Jindalee operational radar network. The two circles that are appearing have a radius of 1,000 kilometers. The considerable amounts of ocean covered by these circles is from where the Chinese can launch a similar missile to the Tomahawk, which they currently have under development. Outside of the drawn coverage, the ability to timely detect a launch is much lower, with the ocean area covered on the east coast alone amounting to over 1.5 million square kilometres. Note also that these drawn arcs are estimates, but we can be reliably sure that the Chinese will have a far better idea. In other words, launching an attack from within the drawn network poses a considerable risk. Outside of the drawn network, the risks are lower. One of the reasons for these priorities in the south is the changing use of submarines. Again, allow me to explain using a historical example. One of the more interesting facts about battleships is that for the first 40 years of their existence, their primary purpose was to sink everything afloat. Given their expense, they were remarkably bad at it. Two examples. In late 1943, the Duke of York engaged the German ship Scharnhorst. It fired 520 shells for 13 hits, but the German ship was only finally sunk by torpedoes from smaller British ships. In 1941, the Bismarck took a remarkable pounding with around 2,000 shells fired at it and perhaps as many as 500 hitting, but again had to be finished off by torpedoes. Then for all the battleships, a curious change happened in 1942. Their primary role became almost exclusively floating gun platforms that, rather than sinking ships, provided an extraordinary amount of firepower in support of the troops on the ground. A similar development is happening with submarines. The addition of multiple vertical launching systems enables them to launch an incredible barrage against ground targets from 1,000 kilometers and perhaps more away. If just half of the missiles on a United States Navy Virginia-class submarine are assigned to ground attack, then upwards of 9 tons of high explosives, or their equivalent, can be delivered by 20 missiles. They would be launched without warning, while enabling the submarine an excellent chance of evading destruction. A little aside here, there are fairly constant forecasts that submarines will become more vulnerable as technology makes the oceans more transparent. Personally, remembering the pre-Second World War Royal Navy view on the impact of ASDIC, I'm a little wary of this forecast. However, technology may force changes in the primary role of submarines. Back to the priorities. The inclusion of Adelaide is a little cheeky. A strike on Adelaide around 2040 would destroy, if not substantially delay, any production of the Orca submarines. Whether China could spare the resources is questionable. Bluntly, if you even partially accept my conclusions, the sword and the shield policy significantly increases the risk of some form of attack on Australia as part of the opening moves in a war in the Western Pacific. What's worse, an integral part of the DSR, the Orca submarines, will still not be in service when these risks are greatest. Now, let's look at what this means for the US if the sword and shield policy was never implemented. Australia will probably be the southern anchor for the foreseeable future regardless. In other words, Australia's ports and airfields may become available for any counterattack by the United States in any fighting for the first island chain. This means nothing to China at the start of any Pacific war. Quite simply, in planning for war, an aggressor does not waste initial resources during the opening attacks by going after targets that are only relevant if they are losing. Hence you'll note the almost complete lack of priorities on Australia. You would put those targets aside for later. Bluntly, you go to war to win. As I have noted previously under ANZUS, the US and Australia are not actually allies. This gave Australia some wriggle room to avoid, either completely or in part, a greater Pacific war. This meant that prior to the sword and the shield policy, the Chinese would be hesitant to initially attack Australia because that would guarantee our belligerency. In other words, Doubts about our intentions provides Australia with a shield against an initial attack. Equally, doubt about our intention provides a shield that allows America to use our infrastructure if it is needed. Is the sword and the shield policy worth it for both America and Australia? That is the question. Interestingly, the sword and the shield policy creates the risk of an escalation nightmare involving Australia. How will America respond if the target is not Taiwan, but some form of raid upon Australia, as in the example here of a submarine-launched missile attack against Tyndall? The answer may seem obvious, but that may not always be the case given the chaos that is engulfing America's domestic politics. The result of America preferring a diplomatic solution over some type of raid on Australia may be the collapse in Taiwan's belief that the United States will protect them. The logical result for Taiwan's leadership is to enter into some type of accord with China to avoid military disaster. In all honesty, this was the premise of the scenario I presented at the end of my book. It was written well before the solidification of the sword and the shield policy. That scenario was instead based around China trying to accelerate the withdrawal of the US from the Western Pacific. However, the purpose of the raid and the outcomes sought are remarkably similar. I will certainly acknowledge that strategic policy realists on both sides of the Pacific see the sword and the shield as both a logical progression and an excellent outcome. And again, I believe in our close military relationship with America and the importance of Taiwan to Australia's defence. The problem for me is that strategic policy realists don't live in the real world. The rest of us have to live with and pay, sometimes with our lives or the lives of our loved ones, for their plans. To Swan and Houston, the author of the DSR, Moriarty, the Defence Department Secretary, and also Defence Minister Miles, Australians deserve to both know and have a say before you demand that we pay that price. Does all this mean that I'm suggesting that Australia should walk away from defending Taiwan? As usual in strategic policy, that's the wrong question. The population of Taiwan is the same as Australia. They've had a hard road, but they are living in a vibrant liberal democracy that has dramatically increased their standard of living over the last half-century. If for no other reason, they deserve our support and protection. Equally, Australia and the rest of the democratic world can't sit back and allow it to be turned into a battlefield. The impact of a modern war on a country of 25 million in an area smaller than Tasmania would prove devastating. Nor can we believe some form of agreement with China's communist regime will have any value whatsoever. Remember Hong Kong. The question Taiwan's allies need to ask is how do we manage any transition without throwing Taiwan under the bus? Equally, it is a discussion that needs to involve most Australians. Some of the issues both Taiwan and its allies need to manage are: 1, preventing strategic industries and personnel from becoming sequestered by China, providing a safe haven to members of the political, military and intelligence communities, plus civil servants and media who are at most risk of reprisals, managing a refugee intake of unknown numbers, and developing an accord with the Chinese regime that gives some form of special status to Taiwan. Okay, I know I said that an agreement with China isn't worth the paper it is written on. I haven't changed my opinion. The problem with the Hong Kong handover was that it didn't have a guard dog. Clearly, the West is not going to go to war with China if they have already backed off from the promise to defend Taiwan, which leaves economic penalties. They must be automatically implemented, in which we have to discuss the governance, publicly announced as part of the settlement. They need to act as a deterrent, not some kind of post-event punishment as happened to Russia. They need to be for a set period. They need to involve as many nations as possible. And the big one, we need to manage the domestic impact within Australia, which means we need external assistance. Okay, it sounds like I have solved it all and given us peace in our time, just like Chamberlain did in the 30s. The problem is that it will never happen. Like Chamberlain abandoning Czechoslovakia in 1938, America will probably give up Taiwan, and that may not be far away. When insiders like Rupert Murdoch have started saying America will not defend Taiwan, the world, and especially China, listens. Like Churchill, who became Prime Minister after Chamberlain, we will probably find ourselves committed to the wrong pre-war plans. As the abandonment of Taiwan becomes increasingly likely, and then inevitably happens, it will leave us with three questions. Why and how will China militarily threaten Australia? Which then leads us inevitably onto how do we deter the same. I will cover them in the next few presentations.